Hello, Mr. Moran. My name's Hunter Brown, and I'm going to be talking about evolution. And I hope you're doing well. All this crazy stuff in the world. But yeah, let's continue on. Evolution is a little bit of a sensitive subject due to the fact that not because evolution itself is argued, that everyone pretty much makes sense with that. Like it's the adaptation of species over time. The only people that argue about is the fact that origin of life is questioned. So I'm going to be giving my evidence about all the stuff about evolution, and then I'm going to go with the conclusion about do I go towards evolution or away from evolution. And yeah, let's get into this. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is natural selection. Now, natural selection is the process of whereby organisms better adapt to their environment, tend to survive, and produce more offspring. This theory of its action was first expounded by or shown by Charles Darwin and is now believed to be the main process that brings about evolution. Okay? Now, natural selection, for an example, would be, let's say you had a gene in the gene pool where you can run faster from predators, or you're stronger. That gene would then be spread onto one person. That person would then survive, reproduce, and that gene would spread on. Now, the gene where you're slower might fade away due to the fact that it's survivably adaptational. So you want to be fast, you want to be strong. That's what you want to be. Another example would be, let's say, camo. Let's say you have orange beetles and green beetles. Green beetles would better be suited for plains, while orange beetles would not, and those beetles would die out, and then you would have the green beetle gene spread on, and that would be the dominant gene of that species. So that's basically natural selection. The next thing I'm going to talk about is about differential reproductive success. Now, this is based on natural selection again, but differential success is talking about the survival rate, the survivability that an organism is going to survive and produce offspring. Now, there are different percentages for different species, but if you are camoed into your environment better, let's say like green beetles, right? They're more likely to survive and reproduce their offspring. So there's a higher percentage that gene would spread on. The orange beetle, however, has a lower percentage. That means that it would less likely to survive due to the fact that they can't blend into their environment. So that gene, the green gene, would also spread on. This could create diversity by the sense that if a certain gene is not viable in a ecosystem, then the species would start shifting towards a certain color. Same thing with the orange and green beetles. If you had, let's say you had like some mix between, let's say it's a non-dominant, you'd do a mix between, the graph would start shifting towards green because green is more of a viable trait. You could also see, let's say red is more viable, and then you have green and orange. Well, it will start thinning and go towards the very middle, which I think I have in my notes here. It's called stabilizing selection. That's called stabilizing selection. When it thins out towards the middle. If we had green and orange and red was the best, then it would go towards the middle. If we pretend. Now and then, if you have diversifying selection, let's say green and orange are viable but not red, species would start going towards those two, and eventually green and orange bugs might become a whole different species, which means they cannot reproduce with each other. This can also have an allopatric and sympatric speciation could also have an effect on this. If there's a geography border, let's say mountains, and there's wolves traveled around it, the wolves on one side of the mountain might be completely different than the wolves on the other side of the mountain. Okay. Next thing we're going to talk about is genetic flow, gene flow, and mutation. Now, all of these still play a role in natural selection. Natural selection is the biggest part of evolution, after all. So we'll start with gene flow. Genetic drift, sorry. Genetic drift is when there's a change in the frequency of an existing gene. So what that means is that if you have, let's say, 50% reds and 50% oranges, and orange is way more viable than red for camo, then you'll start seeing a shift in the frequency of an existing gene. You would probably see orange appearing more and red appearing less. So over time, it'd probably change from 50-50 to like 70-30 to 80-20, and so on and so on, until eventually it leads to an equilibrium where it just stops and sticks there until there's another change. Gene flow is when in a population, gene flow is the transfer of genetic variations from one population to the other. So this means if you have a population and that's moving, that gene will be transferred still to that population, but it's going to chain and give more genetic variation, allowing for more different things. You can also say that if there's two populations and they're close enough together to reproduce, you might even say that they could be one single population instead of just two. That can go both ways. Mutation is kind of the random factor, however, in evolution. I mean, you really can't prove when evolutions happen. We can mutation, sorry. You can kind of tell when mutation's going to happen, like if you had too much radiation or random. It's just random, basically. But mutation is when a genetic gene is changed into something that is not meant to be. For an example, let's say you want to reproduce an orange bug, or you're going to produce a red bug, but then there's a genetic mutation that makes a green bug. Mutation can often make either new species or nothing really changes. That means either the species just dies out, or it could be a whole brand new species. Who knows? The next thing I want to talk about is macroevolution. Now, macroevolution, there are 4 theories about where the origin of life came from. Now, these 4 theories have different advantages and disadvantages to their statement, but we'll just continue. So the first thing is the Miller-Urey experiment. This experiment is about how if you have a certain amount of starting materials and then you put an electric spark, you can create organic molecules. So what they did is they took hydrogen, methane, ammonia, water vapor, and they put it in these tubes, and they put an electric spark in it. This caused hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, and all the organic molecules to be formed. This is a good show that life could have formed from that environment. However, the early atmosphere of the Earth might have been very different. Maybe even organisms didn't even come from organic molecules. Like, they don't have to. We can't prove it. RNA, the RNA world theory, is when you have RNA sitting somewhere, is existed, and then it evolves later into DNA in proteins, and is capable of replication and catalyst, which means that it can start replicating itself, creating cells. In this, there's the evidence that ribosome catalyzation and biological reactions happen, and sometimes even self-replication happens in this experiment. The only problem is that nucleotides, which are the different nucleic acids that could be inside, like uracil, thymine, adenine, guanine, cytosine, they might be a little bit too complex to make, which is why it's kind of not really, doesn't seem right, and also RNA is kind of unstable as well. The bubble theory is where lipids in water will start to form bubbles due to hydrophobic actions. So they'll just start forming little bubbles. Like, if you put oil in water, you'll start to see they form together into these little bubbles and float to the top. This is proven by how these bubbles of lipids form really crazily in water. The only problem is that we never made cells in a laboratory, and if you can't make cells in a laboratory where you can have a controlled environment, then there's no way that it probably would happen naturally, because that'd be too low of a percentage. And then lastly, we have the endosymbiotic theory, which is when prokaryotes get eaten by a eukaryote, and those eukaryotes, instead of devouring them, they decide to make a truce, and the bacteria will take all of its new energy and just sit there and relax like a king. But it would have to produce more energy for the prokaryote, so it gets this bunch of build things because it's got so much building blocks. while the eukaryote will provide shelter and get more stuff out of having more energy. This has been proven because we have seen prokaryotic endosymbiotics. We've seen those before. They exist. Now, there is no opposing argument yet, but there might be one. It's just it's not said in my notes. So, all right. So those theories, the advantages, disadvantages, you can believe if you believe it, then good for you. But those are just different theories about origin of life. The last thing is that there is evidence that we have a common ancestor, and this is provided by fossil records, biogeography, and homeologies. Like, for example, similar structures in our body. So fossils are preserved traces or remains of a living organism from the past. So this could be like a dead animal, like let's say a raccoon or a horse or something like that. And those fossils will remain in the dirt, and then we find them, and we can estimate the time of which that thing existed by how deep it is in the ground and by using carbon dating and other tools like that. This can also give us a sense of what environment was up there. Like, if you see the same fossils repeated millions and millions of years again and again, the environment probably didn't change much. However, if you see fossils go from fish to horses, then back to fish, or maybe to like, if you see a random change, maybe even see like goats, then you might see that there's been a big change to that environment. So that's one way. Fossils can lead us back to a common ancestor. Like, if you look at the fossils for humans, you can actually see similar structures in that as well. If biogeography is another example where there was a theory that all the landmass on this earth used to be connected together to form a supercontinent called Pangea. And this is proven by the fact that there are fossils with similar structures, very similar, on two different continents, which doesn't really make sense, since how are you supposed to take a giraffe and swim it across the ocean to get to South America? Well, this could be explained by land theory. And this could also explain common ancestry, because we would have a common ancestry on the Pangea, and then when the landmass is separated, those species would change so much that we would have multiple different species of probably humans. Like, we probably have a Homo sapien and Homo habilis, and we can, And then the last thing is homeologies, which are similar structures in our bones and also in how we are shaped. For example, bats and penguins have the similar bone structure of how their wings are formed. It will start with the humerus, and then it leads to the radius. The bone structure is pretty simple, so we could probably see that those two animals used to have a common ancestry. We can do the same with humans, alligators, and cats. We have basically the same bone structure. Now, the bones don't look the same. They're not even probably the same size. It's just they have the similar way they're formed. Like, if you look at the fingers of a cat, an alligator, and a human, they're pretty similar. Even though humans have longer, more thinner fingers, alligators have more like duck-shaped fins, where they have little claws on each end of their finger. They're shorter and they're more for water, and then cats are more have claws and stuff. So that's another way we see. We can also see this in birds and bats. Birds and bats pretty much have almost the same structure, which makes sense. They can both fly, and if they can both fly, then we can probably tell that their structures were similar at one point. Maybe even the pterodactyl could have been the ancestry of a bird and a bat. So those all lead back to common ancestry, which is another theory about the origin of life. Now, after all this, and after analyzing each of these different things, it is kind of hard to make a judgment. I mean, you can see there's plenty of evidence pointing towards evolution. We can see that undoubtedly. There, however, is not really a crazy amount of evidence towards a single direction of origin of life. I mean, there's too many directions. Like, the experiment said they were formed from an atmosphere, like with the origin thing. Some people say it was from water with the bubble theory, or maybe it was RNA from the RNA world theory, or endosymbiotics. We can't really tell. And because of that, because it's so inconsistent about what theory we think it is, and we're kind of like all over the place, I'm going to say I'm more towards just religion in general. I mean, number one, there's not enough evidence, and number two, the evidence is kind of like all over the place. It's too spread out for one judgment. It's kind of like you have multiple judgments and you can't answer any of them because you don't have enough evidence. So for me, I would say religion because the fact there's not enough evidence. I mean, the Miller-Urey experiment has a pretty good counter, same as the bubble theory, and same as the RNA world theory. Natural selection, I believe in that 100%. Evolution, I believe, definitely. I mean, there's no way you can get around not having evolution. It's just the theories don't add up. And the common ancestry, I can see that that also works out. I believe that we have a common ancestor, but not in that way. Not in the way that we were from cells and we evolved up to this. And I'd like to thank you, Mr. Moran, for watching this, and I hope that you liked my examples and what I talked about. Thank you.